He was told to pick up papers off the floor in front of 30 executives after being mistaken for office support, not because he lacked qualifications, but because of the color of his skin and the seat he dared to take at their table. And no one in that room saw a problem with it, not even when he corrected their financial projections with the very report they had stolen from him. What they didn't know was that the intern they humiliated was actually sent to test them. And before this story ends, billion-dollar careers will fall, reputations will collapse, and the man they dismissed will decide who stays and who vanishes. So before we reveal what happened when he came back in a suit they couldn't ignore, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this from and which moment stunned you most. On the 32nd floor of Crestmont Global's New York headquarters, the glass walls of the executive boardroom shimmered with late morning light. Malik Carter, a 24-year-old intern in the Strategic Growth Division, stepped inside with quiet confidence. His ID badge, clipped neatly to his lapel, was the only thing marking him apart from the sea of tailored suits and Rolex watches already seated around the table. The men and women present were seasoned executives, their conversations flowing with familiar authority, their laughs echoing off marble floors. As Malik moved toward his assigned seat at the far end of the table, his presence barely registered. Only a brief glance from the CEO, Douglas Crane, acknowledged him, more out of curiosity than recognition. Malik opened his laptop and sat upright, scanning the agenda he'd prepared for 2 weeks. No one asked his name, no one welcomed him. Douglas, a gray-haired man with a commanding posture, shifted his attention to a conversation with Vivian Locke, the company's chief operating officer. Vivian leaned in, murmured something, and both chuckled. Celine noticed the smirk on Douglas's face, the way he tapped the pen like a gavel sealing judgment. The meeting began without introduction or preamble. As department heads reviewed numbers and projections, Malik observed, calculated, and stayed silent. He wasn't here to interrupt. Not yet. When the topic shifted to market diversification, Malik's area of study, his pulse quickened slightly. He had spent nights running simulations and preparing a model that could potentially save the firm millions. As he leaned forward to contribute, Douglas raised a hand without looking his way. His voice was calm but dismissive. They were moving on. Malik paused, retracted his hand, and resumed listening. Around him, no one objected. No one questioned the CEO's tone. It was as if Malik's voice belonged outside these walls, no matter how sharp his ideas were. His presence served a function. His contribution did not. During the break, coffee was brought in by catering staff. Vivian stood and glanced briefly at the refreshments, then turned toward the intern's end of the table. Before a word was spoken, Douglas glanced at Malik again. There was no verbal command, but the gesture was enough. Malik stood, walked to the cart, and began distributing drinks with steady hands. The executives accepted their cups without acknowledgement. This wasn't about service. It was about place. Malik understood that. He returned to his chair, now aware of the power dynamic that hummed beneath every word, every silence, every unspoken expectation. He knew this environment. It had many names, but one face. As the meeting resumed, Malik noticed a data discrepancy in a revenue projection slide. It was a simple formula error, one that could alter forecasted outcomes drastically. He circled it quietly on his printout and waited for the moment to raise it. When the time came, he spoke with caution, pointing to the line item and referencing the potential miscalculation. Douglas turned his head slowly and stared at him, expressionless. Vivian leaned over to glance at the sheet, then looked away. No one responded. The conversation shifted to the next item as if nothing had been said. Malik sat back. The mistake remained uncorrected. He now understood that in this room, even facts were filtered by rank. Malik arrived early, taking his seat without ceremony. His expression was composed, his manner efficient. Though last time had left a bitter trace, he remained calm. He wasn't there to react, he was there to study. This time, he carried updated printouts of a revised analysis he had spent all night preparing. A few junior staff entered quietly, followed by the executives. Douglas Crane walked in with a thin stack of files in one hand. He stopped next to Malik's seat without saying a word. With a slight, deliberate flick of the wrist, he let the entire stack fall to the floor, right in front of Malik's shoes. The papers scattered unevenly. The room froze. Conversations halted. But no one gasped. No one intervened. It was the kind of act that was both theatrical and intentional, yet quiet enough to pass as trivial. Douglas folded his arms and waited, as if Malik were part of the carpet, another detail to be managed by someone else. Slowly, Malik bent down and collected the papers, his movements steady, fingers crisp, raising unreadable. When he returned the stack to the table, Douglas had already turned away. The message had been sent. It was not a test of efficiency. It was a test of submission. Malik did not speak. He looked down briefly, exhaled once, and kept his posture straight. Midway through the session, Malik raised his hand once again. The topic had shifted to growth projections in overseas markets, a subject he had modeled with precision. His voice was firm, clear, and concise as he introduced himself and offered context for his recommendations. But just as he was forming the second sentence, Vivian locked slightly. Her shoulders tightened as if rejecting a presence, not a point. She didn't interrupt, but her silence was louder than any dismissal. A few board members looked at each other, amused. Malik's proposal was not addressed. The agenda moved on, his contribution dissolved in the air. The energy in the room began to curdle. Even the assistants along the back wall had noticed the imbalance. One of them, a young woman named Jenna, glanced at Malik with brief sympathy before returning to her tablet. Malik caught the glance but didn't hold it. He wasn't interested in sympathy. He was collecting weight. He was watching how power cloaked itself in formality and how cruelty masked itself with policy. The meeting continued with congratulatory tones among the leadership as Vivian presented metrics Malik recognized as partly sourced from his own internal drafts. But she didn't mention that. No citation, no acknowledgement. Just a performance, polished and praised. By the end of the meeting, Malik remained in his seat as the room cleared. Chairs squeaked, shoes clicked, and voices floated toward elevators. He waited, allowing himself one last look around the empty table, now filled only with discarded agendas and half-empty coffee cups. The room smelled of air conditioning and ego. He packed his laptop, filed away the unused copies of his proposal, and left without a word. In the elevator, his reflection stared back at him from chrome panels. Despite being treated like a shadow in the last two meetings, he remained professional. Inside, the silence had been building like steam, but he wore calmness like armor. As Douglas and Vivian entered the room, flanked by two other senior VPs, Malik nodded respectfully. They didn't return it. The meeting kicked off with the usual exchange of buzzwords and surface-level praise. When the topic transitioned to global growth potential, Malik opened his laptop and prepared to present a concise projection he'd modeled the night before. The model demonstrated how small investments in specific emerging markets could yield long-term returns, with reduced volatility. Malik leaned forward slightly, gesturing toward his data, and began explaining his findings with clear language and structure. But as his voice cut into the room, the reaction was immediate and cold. Douglas didn't even look up. Vivian tapped her pen slowly on the table. The others avoided eye contact entirely, acting as if Malik had never spoken. For a moment, Malik paused. He scanned the room and recognized something more calculated than indifference. This was coordinated dismissal. His words had weight. The content had merit. But they were waiting for him to feel. It didn't matter. When he attempted to finish his thought, Douglas finally raised his hand, not to acknowledge Malik's analysis but to stop him mid-sentence. With a blank tone, Douglas turned to him and said they were running low on refreshments, then suggested that Malik head downstairs to restock the coffee tray. The implication was not lost on anyone. The timing was precise, the tone flat. It was not a question. It was a command. Malik stood slowly, ignoring the burn in his chest. He looked at the table for a moment longer, then quietly walked out, carrying the empty coffee carafe in one hand. The hallway outside was colder than usual. As he waited for the elevator, he stared at his reflection again. This time, it wasn't anger he saw, it was calculation. He returned 15 minutes later, placing the tray down gently. Then, his seat remained untouched, his documents unopened. Jenna, the assistant from last time, offered a silent nod as he sat back down. He didn't respond. He no longer needed confirmation of what was unfolding. He had enough. The meeting concluded with applause once again, this time for a report Vivian delivered, which borrowed several phrasing patterns and line items from Malik's draft. She didn't flinch while presenting it. Douglas smiled. The board clapped. Malik didn't move. He kept his hands folded as if waiting for something more than permission to belong. When everyone filed out of the room, a few chairs scraped too loud, as if people were rushing to escape the discomfort. Malik stayed behind a few minutes longer. He had just watched his research presented under someone else's name, and he had just been sent out for coffee like a temp. But Eric did. Eric Michaels was a mid-level analyst in the finance department, white, mid-30s, known for his detailed spreadsheets and surprisingly dry humor. He had once asked Malik about a data model after hours, and ended up chatting with him for 20 minutes about predictive analytics. That interaction, brief as it was, had left Malik with a sense of normalcy, respect even. 2 days after the coffee incident, Malik saw Eric walking toward him in the corridor near the executive elevator. Malik raised a hand slightly, a natural reflex of acknowledgement. Eric saw him, hesitated, then quickly shifted his path toward a side door. No nod, no eye contact, just avoidance. Later that day, Malik overheard two assistants whispering outside Douglas's office. Eric had been called in privately for a long conversation. One of them said he looked shaken when he left. Malik didn't need to hear the words to know what had happened. Guilt had a smell, and fear always left a trail. By Friday morning, Malik was back at his cubicle early, finalizing a presentation that was originally scheduled for the following week. He had spent hours refining the insights, identifying patterns in domestic expansion, pricing elasticity, and operational inefficiencies. His goal had been simple: prove value through precision. But when he checked the shared company folder, his entire draft was gone. Not edited, removed. A new file had replaced it, identical in structure, layout, and even phrases, but this version listed Vivian Locke as the primary author. Her name sat bold on the front page. Malik scrolled line by line, stunned by how little had been changed. The voice that was his. The voice. He sat still for a long time. The open plan office around him buzzed with idle Monday conversations. Someone laughed about weekend brunch. Someone else asked about printer toner. Malik didn't hear any of it. He looked at the screen, the stolen credit staring back at him like a dare. He didn't slam the desk. He didn't send an email. Instead, he saved a copy and printed out both versions, the original and Vivian's. He compared them silently, using a pen to mark the places where she had changed no more than a word or two. Then he placed the papers in a folder, labeled it privately, and locked it in his drawer. Later that afternoon, the company-wide calendar pinged with a new event. An emergency strategy session had been added to the executive team's schedule. Vivian would be presenting updated growth recommendations. Malik didn't need to open the attachment. He knew what was inside. It was the presentation he had been preparing. He watched from his desk as a group of executives walked past, one of them commenting about how sharp Vivian's proposal had looked. Another said she was finally showing vision. Malik stared at the floor, then at his hands. They hadn't just taken his work, they were polishing it for applause. That evening, the lights in the office dimmed as people left for the day. Malik remained seated, his screen open to a spreadsheet that no longer mattered. Eric passed behind him once, heading toward the elevators. Malik waited for a word, even a glance, but there was nothing. It was held in the larger conference auditorium 2 floors above the usual boardroom, with name placards, printed agendas, and reserved seating. Malik, still listed as an intern on the register, received a last-minute invite marked attendance optional. He understood the implication, but he attended anyway, dressed in a charcoal suit, his expression composed but watchful. He sat quietly at the end of the second row, notebook open, folder in hand. His mind was calm. His memory remained sharp. As the meeting progressed, each executive took turns presenting updates and projections. The atmosphere was ceremonial, filled with performative affirmations and corporate jargon. Vivian stood at the podium to deliver her segment on strategy alignment. She repeated, almost word for word, the same analysis Malik had constructed weeks earlier. A few graphs had been resized, a few keywords replaced, but the logic. Malik didn't flinch. He noted timestamps, reactions, and which board members nodded most enthusiastically. When she finished, applause echoed across the auditorium. One executive even leaned over to Douglas and whispered, "Best quarter vision I've seen in years." Midway through the next presentation, Malik's name was suddenly mentioned. Douglas, glancing at the intern table, said that since the company was exploring inclusivity and future planning, perhaps the intern from strategy could offer a brief comment. The tone was deceptive, framed as an invitation but shaped like a trap. All heads turned to Malik. He stood slowly, folder still in hand, unsure whether this was genuine interest or another public test. He opened his mouth to speak, ready to provide a carefully measured response. But within seconds, Douglas raised a hand sharply and turned away. "That's enough," he said to the room, dismissing Malik as if he had already spoken out of turn. A beat of silence followed. Then the presenter resumed as if nothing had happened. Malik stood motionless for a second longer before lowering his folder and returning to his seat. But before he could sit, another voice from the front table, one of Douglas's closest allies, spoke up, half laughing. "Interns are here to observe, not to interrupt flow." The line was casual, meant to draw smiles, and it did. Several in the room chuckled softly, not maliciously perhaps, but out of habit. Malik remained standing. Douglas turned back briefly and gestured toward the exit. "Take a moment outside if you need it." Malik walked out without a word. His steps were steady, measured, but each one pounded with weight. As he opened the doors and stepped into the corridor, he could still hear them behind him. The low hum of resumed conversation, the residual laughter, a final chuckle that lingered too long. Words echoed through the half-closed doors. He really thought he had something to say. Malik paused mid-step, but didn't look back. He reached the far end of the hallway, pressed his hand against the cool glass of the window, and allowed himself a single breath. That moment, more than any other, revealed the full picture. It wasn't just the theft of work. It wasn't just the silencing. It was the ritual, the choreography of humiliation dressed in corporate decorum. He didn't return to the room. Instead, he sat alone in an unused conference space, pulled out his folder and began writing. Not out of anger, but for clarity. Every event, every dismissal, every phrase spoken in front of him and about him was now being logged. The pattern was no longer subtle. But before he could settle into routine, a company-wide side memo landed in every inbox with the subject line, "Strategic Streamlining Initiative, Internship Programs, Update." It was brief, clinical, and devoid of emotion. The company had decided to pause its diversity internship pilot, effective immediately. All participants were released from their program roles. Malik read the message twice, not out of confusion, but to let the weight of its timing sink in. Less than 24 hours after being publicly humiliated in front of executives, the initiative that allowed his presence in the building had been terminated. He didn't need to ask why. It wasn't about metrics or productivity. It was about control. The message had been decided long before the meeting. What happened yesterday wasn't spontaneous. It was the final rehearsal before the curtain dropped. Malik sat still, staring at the message, his face neutral, hands folded. Around him, the office slowly filled. Colleagues passed by. Some nodded absently. Most said nothing. No one mentioned the memo. After an hour, Malik opened his drawer and began gathering his things. There wasn't much, just a few printed reports, a notepad filled with detailed charts, a copy of his first rejected proposal, and the folder where he kept his documentation. He moved with precision, not rushing, not dragging. A few employees looked up, saw the box, and quickly looked away. Jenna passed by once, hesitated at her desk, then stood, walked to the break room, and didn't return for 20 minutes. No one approached Malik. No one offered a handshake or a thank you. In a place obsessed with optics, even farewell had to be calculated. He walked toward the elevator carrying the box with both hands. Each step echoed slightly in the marble hallway. The silence behind him felt heavier than noise. At the elevator, he pressed the button and waited. The mirrored surface reflected a man unchanged on the outside but sharper in posture. When the doors opened, no one was inside. He stepped in, turned around and watched the floors rise behind him in the glass wall opposite. 32, 31, 30. The descent wasn't just physical, it was deliberate. Reaching the lobby, he walked out through the turnstiles, badge clipped to his shirt for the last time. The receptionist glanced up, unsure whether to say goodbye, then chose not to. Malik stepped into the cold air. He had seen how systems worked from the inside, and he knew that real power never announced itself with noise. It built itself quietly, through patience, strategy, and timing. Back at home, Malik unpacked the box, set the folder aside, and opened his laptop. He began reviewing emails, documents, timestamps. He reconstructed timelines, matched phrases, and organized datasets into categories. Not for vengeance, but for record. What he had endured was not unique. Douglas Crane arrived before most and took his seat at the head of the boardroom. Vivian Locke followed closely, her stride tight and her brow furrowed. Chairs filled quickly with the company's top officers and legal counsel. Conversations were subdued, speculative. The assistants who usually prepped the room had been replaced by silent, unfamiliar staff in tailored suits. The tension in the air wasn't routine. It was expensive. No one knew who had called the meeting, only that it had been ordered directly by Cressmont's parent holding group. Whispers rippled through the room, rumors of a potential acquisition, questions about the sudden halt of a massive international project, speculation over shifting board votes. But the most common phrase passed between anxious lips was the same: "Who's coming?" When the clock struck 9, the double glass doors opened. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then, footsteps entered, measured, confident, steady. Malik Carter walked into the room, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, briefcase in hand, followed by 2 advisors in discreet black attire. The room froze. Malik did not look away. He stepped forward, placed the briefcase on the table, and stood at the front of the room. The executive stared in disbelief. Douglas's face paled, though his jaw remained clenched. Vivian blinked slowly, as if trying to recalculate reality. Malik introduced himself with clarity and authority. His title was now Director of Strategic Acquisitions, Orion Group, a global private equity firm currently finalizing due diligence on a $2 billion majority buyout of Cressmont Global. The pause that followed was absolute. Every breath in the room stalled. No one laughed. No one blinked. The intern was no longer an intern. Malik opened the briefcase and retrieved a prenatal day. He placed a small remote beside it, syncing to the room's projection system without asking for permission. He explained that as part of Orion's unique acquisition model, it often conducted embedded assessments of company culture and leadership effectiveness prior to any capital transfer. Cressmont had been one such case. Embedded analysis firsthand, observation, strategic documentation. He paused to look directly at Douglas. There was no bitterness in his eyes, only precision. The room remained dead quiet as slides displayed performance charts, internal contradictions, and a timeline of critical failures, all dated, verified, and linked to specific leadership actions. Douglas leaned back in his chair, visibly straining to hold posture. Vivian's arms were crossed tightly now, her nails digging into her own skin. Malik continued the presentation, each point calmly revealing a pattern of negligence, exclusion, and hostile leadership practices. He made no personal remarks. He only presented data, facts, timelines. The same tools they had once used to erase his name were now the tools reshaping their futures, and for the first time, none of them could interrupt. When the presentation ended, Malik handed a printed dossier to each member of the board. He explained that Orion Group would proceed with the buyout under one condition: a restructuring of the entire executive team. This included the termination of Douglas Crane, Vivian Locke, and 3 other senior leaders. Malik remained at the head of the table, hands folded in front of him, waiting. He didn't demand attention. He didn't raise his voice. He simply existed now in a different position, no longer subject to approval, no longer a name to ignore. He had become the mirror, and in that mirror, each person at the table saw something they had spent. He began speaking again, this time in a tone that blended strategy with unflinching truth. He described the embedded observer model used by Orion, explaining how first-hand experience within a company's lowest ranks could expose hidden power dynamics, discriminating practices, and the unspoken rules that shaped company culture more than any policy document. Malik detailed what he had witnessed as an intern. Not just oversight or neglect, but deliberate silencing, intellectual theft, and exclusion masked as professionalism. Each point was supported by time-stamped evidence, internal correspondence, and cross-referenced reporting procedures that the executives themselves had either authored or approved. There were no loud reactions, no shouting or outbursts, just the dull rustling of a few board members finally opening their dossiers. Malik outlined how Orion had used this data not just to assess Cressmont's financial performance, but to evaluate whether its leadership could be trusted with long-term capital. His findings were clear. Under the current executive team, the company posed reputational and economic motive. The culture had failed not because of market forces but because of arrogance, protectionism, and an inability to recognize value when it arrived in unfamiliar packaging. He looked directly at Douglas, then at Vivian, and let the words hang in the air. Orion's conditions were explicit. The acquisition would only proceed if the board voted to restructure executive leadership. That meant immediate removal of those named in the report, a public statement of commitment to inclusive governance, and a 6-month probationary review for all remaining senior staff. Malik made no apologies for the terms. He did not soften them with corporate spin. The era of protected power was over. If Cressmont wanted the deal, it had to prove it deserved it. And proving it would not begin with a diversity committee or a press release. It would begin with accountability. One board member, older and less animated than the rest, finally raised his eyes to speak. He asked if this entire investigation had been planned from the beginning. Malik answered without hesitation. The Observer program had existed long before Cressmont was selected, but once Cressmont entered consideration for acquisition, Malik had been offered the opportunity to lead the evaluation from within. The board member asked if Malik had anticipated this kind of mistreatment. Malik replied that he hadn't needed to. He had simply followed the pattern. What surprised him wasn't the exclusion, it was how normalized it had become. By the end of the briefing, the room had shifted again. The hierarchy that once towered above Malik now leaned inward, uncertain and off balance. Vivian sat with her arms still folded, though her expression had lost its edge. Douglas no longer looked angry, he looked hollow. The rest of the executives avoided each other's eyes. The dossier Malik left behind had been reviewed, annotated, and discussed in closed-door conversations that stretched late into the evening. No one wanted to be the first to speak in defense of Douglas Crane. No one wanted their name associated with the collapse of a public acquisition. The decision came down swiftly. On the morning of the third day, a formal statement was issued. Effective immediately, Douglas Crane would step down from all leadership responsibilities, with no severance, and pending investigation into internal conduct violations. By noon, Douglas's name had been removed from the executive directory. His office was sealed for compliance review. An outside legal team arrived to begin a full audit of hiring practices, internal communications, and whistleblower reports. Malik's embedded findings had triggered more than a leadership transition. They had opened the door to a federal inquiry, now backed by former employees who had been waiting years to be heard. Some sent statements anonymously, others posted publicly. Within hours, headlines surfaced on major outlets. Words like exclusion, retaliation, and systemic failure appeared alongside Douglas's name. The empire he once ruled from a leather chair and polished corner office was unraveling, one receipt at a time. Vivian Locke's fall was faster. Once the internal communications were reviewed, it became clear she had not only appropriated Malik's work, but had done the same to at least 3 junior analysts over the past 2 fiscal years. Screenshots and email trails surfaced. Her habit of editing shared documents and replacing author names was undeniable. She had manipulated promotion pipelines, stalled transfer requests, and built an internal structure of fear disguised as meritocracy. Her shares in the company, once protected by quarterly performance reports she claimed credit for, were frozen pending fraud review. By evening, her resignation hit every major corporate news wire. The press release lacked dignity. Her silence confirmed everything. The broader reaction was swift and public. Employee forums lit up with messages from staff across departments, some expressing relief, others anger. A former intern described how he had been forced out of the company 2 years prior for questioning a director's decision. Another revealed he had been instructed to remove Malik's name from a report draft without explanation. The truth was no longer isolated, it had roots, and those roots had been exposed. Shareholders, sensing volatility, demanded reassurances. Orion Group responded with a direct communication from Malik himself, outlining the transition plan. The tone was measured, no bitterness, only order and clarity. Outside the building, the world watched. News cycles filled with comparisons between Cressmont's downfall and other high-profile collapses rooted in toxic leadership. But there was something different here. The story wasn't just about punishment, it was about precision. Malik had not destroyed them with rage or noise, he had dismantled them with discipline. He had matched every humiliation with evidence, every dismissal with documentation, and when it mattered, he let truth speak louder than retaliation. The executives who once laughed at his presence now struggled to rebuild their names, each one facing a future defined by what they had once chosen to ignore. Inside the company, a shift had begun. Employees no longer whispered in elevators or avoided eye contact in hallways. They spoke openly. Some even reached out to Malik through official channels, offering support, gratitude, and commitment to change. A full year passed since the day Malik walked into the boardroom and flipped the entire corporate structure of Cressmont Global on its head. In that time, the company had transformed. Orion Group completed the acquisition 3 months after the executive removals. A new leadership team was installed, diverse, merit-based, and held to quarterly ethics evaluations as strictly as financial ones. The culture had begun to shift. It wasn't perfect, but it was no longer pretending. Junior analysts spoke freely now. Department meetings included real listening, and for the first time, the break-room conversations didn't go quiet when certain people entered. People had learned what fear sounded like, and now they knew its absence. Malik remained involved through transition, but by the end of the 6th month, he stepped away from day-to-day operations. He moved on to oversee broader acquisition strategy for Orion, but he remained quietly connected to Cressmont's progress. One morning, as he checked his inbox, he found a message titled simply, "I was wrong." It was from Robert Ames, a senior advisor who had once laughed during his public dismissal. The email was long. Robert admitted to complicity, to silence, to the easy comfort of privilege. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He explained what he was doing now, mentoring black college students through a nonprofit accelerator, using his financial network to open doors he had once held closed. He said he had no excuse, but he had chosen not to waste the lesson. Other messages followed in time. Some were short, some anonymous. Some came from employees still inside Cressmont, thanking Malik for giving them a language for what they had experienced. Others came from executives at entirely different firms, asking to learn, to consult, or to avoid their own blind spots. Malik responded selectively, but respectfully. He knew the difference between guilt and growth. He was not interested in revenge. He was interested in shifting measurable change in how power treated silence. And then, there was Douglas Crane. After the investigation concluded, Douglas had retreated from public life. His name had become a case study in executive failure, cited in business schools and journalism exposés. But Malik heard rumors that Douglas had moved to a small town in Virginia, where his sister ran an underfunded education nonprofit. Months later, Malik received confirmation. A local newspaper featured a photo of Douglas in a plain polo shirt and slacks, helping restock bookshelves at a youth learning center. No cameras, no interviews, just quiet, repeated work. One student said Douglas always asked questions but never talked about his past. He listened. He showed up. He brought coffee for the staff. Malik never reached out. He didn't need to. The story had completed itself. The man who once demanded silence now sat among children, absorbing more in one afternoon than he had in 20 years of boardrooms. Malik understood that not all transformations were visible, and not all apologies were spoken. Some were lived, day by day, in the absence of performance. In the presence of humility, at the anniversary of the acquisition, Malik stood on the balcony of his new office, overlooking the Hudson River. He wasn't reflecting on victory. He was thinking about the systems that still remained, the voices still ignored, and the room still designed to exclude. He knew this story was only one thread, but he also knew something had shifted. Somewhere, an intern now walked into a boardroom with his head high, and someone listened, not because the system allowed it, but because someone once forced it to. And if this story moved you even a little, Take a second to like this video and hit subscribe. It helps more people discover voices that often go unheard. What part of Malik's journey hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts and your place in this world.